North London is, well, that depends who you ask really. If you were to ask an Arsenal fan, they would respond with red. Ask a Tottenham fan and they would likely reply lily white. And if you were to ask a Barnet FC fan, they would probably say, thanks very much for checking in on us, not many people ask how we are these days, please buy one of our shirts. But what if I told you that North London wasn't always so congested with football teams? For a club that is so integrated into the local community and identity of Islington, it may be a surprise to hear that Arsenal's story begins not in North London, but in Woolwich, in South East London. More specifically, at an establishment called Royal Arsenal. The Royal Arsenal was used for the manufacture of armaments and ammunition, proofing and explosives research for the British Armed Forces. The Royal Arsenal was of great importance to the British at the time, given the amount of wars that they were involved in, including, but not restricted to, the War of the Third Coalition, the War of the Fourth Coalition, the Anglo-Turkish War, the Gunboat War, the Anglo-Russian War, the Peninsular War, the War of the Fifth Coalition, the Persian Gulf Campaign of 1809, the War of 1812, the War of the Sixth Coalition, the 100 Days War, the Baptist War, the First Carlist War, the Rebellion of 1837, the Pastry War. For the purpose of this video, that's not important. What is important to remember during this time was that English football was dominated by teams in the north and the Midlands of the country, with not one club south of Birmingham playing the game at a professional level. While football was popular in London, it didn't have the following that of other sports, such as cricket and rugby. Enter David Danskin, a Scot from Fife who worked at the Arsenal munitions factory in Woolwich. Danskin was a football man, but being in an area that was more engaged with cricket and rugby, he was bored out of his nut. Rather than mope about or succumb to the domination of other sports in the area, Danskin took matters into his own hands by founding his own football team with the help of his friends Elijah Watkins, John Humble and Richard Pearce. They were soon joined by two Nottingham Forest footballers who had relocated to London, Fred Beardsley and Maurice Bates. Danskin & Co managed to rally together an initial squad of 15 men, each chucking in a sixpence, a few quid in today's money, to help start the club. Danskin, who was flush with cash apparently, added an extra 3 shillings, a whopping £10, to buy a football for the team, a fairly important investment for any football startup. In December 1886, the club arranged its first match to be played across the Thames in the Isle of Dogs, against the not-so-mighty Eastern Wanderers. Despite Danskin's side not having a name, a home ground, or even a kit at this point, they reportedly won the match 6-0. For the purposes of the match, the team were referred to as Dial Square, after one of the factory's workshops, but were quickly renamed to Royal Arsenal, a combination of their place of work and the pub that they presumably had a regular piss-up, the Royal Oak in Woolwich. Name sorted, Royal Arsenal went about finding some cheapest chips kits to play in, so they wouldn't have to play shirtless all the time. Unfortunately for Royal Arsenal, Sports Direct wasn't open in the 19th century, but fortunately for Royal Arsenal, they had Fred Beardsley. Legend has it, Beardsley got in touch with his former club Nottingham Forest, asking if they could possibly donate some shirts to keep them warm in the cold British winter, and they kindly obliged, sending a complete set of red shirts. However, finding a permanent home to play football proved more difficult. Royal Arsenal would spend the next few years bouncing between a number of places. Arsenal initially played their home matches in Plumstead Common, but quickly moved to a field on Plumstead Marshes in September 1887. It was renamed the Sportsman Ground after the Sportsman pub nearby, which continued the theme of things being named after pubs. 6 months later, after extensive flooding to the Sportsman Ground, Royal Arsenal moved again, this time to Manor Field, which itself was renamed to Manor Ground, not after a pub unfortunately this time. Manor Ground was reportedly an awful place to play. Not only was it muddy, but it was right next to a sewer, which was a surefire way to deter supporters. Then again, this was the 1800s. Speaking of supporters, there were no stands at Manor Ground, so Danskin and friends had to borrow wagons from nearby army bases to house spectators. So they weren't standing in shit. In 1890, Royal Arsenal moved again, this time to the Invicta Ground. The Invicta Ground was a much more suitable venue for home football, partly because it already had a terrace stand and changing rooms, but also because they were no longer playing in a cesspit. Unfortunately, after 3 years of comfort, the Invicta Ground owners stuck up rent, a concept that many living and working in London are all too familiar with, and thus they moved back to the Manor Ground. Regardless of being constantly on the move, the vagrant Royal Arsenal were successful in this period, winning the Kent Senior Cup and London Charity Cup in 1890 and the London Senior Cup in 1891. Despite this success, and due to their amateur status, Royal Arsenal lost a number of key players to professional teams in the north of the country. So in May 1891, Royal Arsenal made the decision to adopt professionalism in order to deter bigger teams stealing their best players. To match their new status as a professional football club, Royal Arsenal desperately needed funds to bring Manor Ground up to speed, on account of it still being a shithole. To do this, the members of the club voted to form a limited company in order to raise funds through the selling of shares. This is where a name change was forced on the club. You see, in the UK, it is not possible to form a limited company with the word Royal in the title without special dispensation. Because of this, Arsenal dropped the Royal, replaced it with Woolwich, and so in 1893, the Woolwich Arsenal Football and Athletic Company was born. To the disappointment of sports journalists working to a minimum word count at the time, this was shortened to Woolwich Arsenal. Name changed, and with a brand new shiny stand being built at Manor Ground, Arsenal set about applying to the Football League, and were admitted to the second division of English football for the 1893-1894 season. In doing so, Woolwich Arsenal became the first club south of Birmingham to enter the Football League, a decision that no doubt delighted the northern fans of the rest of the Football League. Woolwich Arsenal would eventually be promoted from the second division 10 years later, in 1904, led by manager Harry Bradshaw, which the club would celebrate by building a second stand at Manor Ground, raising the capacity from 6,000 to 20,000 spectators, a figure that Arsenal would not get anywhere near filling on a regular basis. So what happened next? Well, let me tell you what happened next. Woolwich Arsenal's finances were in a dire state. Rising costs of running a football club, as well as poor attendance, meant that the club were flirting with bankruptcy for most of the turn of the century. Arsenal's average attendance in the top flight of English football was 11,000. Compare that with Chelsea's average gate of 28,000 per game, and you could see why this would be a problem for the club. Truth be told, Manor Ground was a right ball ache to get to. There were many more easily accessible football clubs elsewhere in the city, so why go to watch Woolwich Arsenal? To compound this, not a lot of people lived nearby, and many who were able to make the trip often didn't fancy spending their Saturday afternoon in a heavily industrialised area next to a sewer. Eventually, after years of financial peril, in 1910 Woolwich Arsenal faced bankruptcy and extinction from the face of football, until help came from an unlikely source. In 1910, businessman and chairman of Fulham Football Club Henry Norris, as well as friend William Hall, each purchased 19% of the ailing Woolwich Arsenal, the former of which becoming chairman in 1912. Norris identified that in order to survive long-term, Woolwich Arsenal needed a drastic change of direction. His initial plan was to merge Woolwich Arsenal with Fulham Football Club, forming a sort of hybrid London super club mutant thing. However, this was quickly blocked by the Football League for being utter nonsense. Undeterred, Norris turned his attention to relocating the club to a new stadium. If football fans would not come to Woolwich Arsenal, then Woolwich Arsenal would come to them. Norris and Hall considered sites in Battersea and Haringey, but neither suited their needs. Highbury, north of the River Thames, would mean close proximity to another club, Tottenham, something Norris wanted to avoid. But the nearby underground station at Gillespie Road, as well as highly populated residential area, would increase the club's chances of attracting large crowds and made Highbury a compelling option. The law of Highbury proved impossible to ignore, and in 1913 Norris paid a whopping £20,000 for a 21-year lease on land owned by the Church of England at Highbury. Understandably, other clubs were not pleased. In fact, they were pissed. Tottenham, Clapton Orient, Leyton Orient, who were then playing at Homerton, and for some reason Chelsea, despite being nowhere near the new stadium, all complained to the League Management Committee about the proposed new stadium, as they feared it would reduce the number of people attending their games. And local residents were none too pleased as well. But Arsenal were allowed to stay at their new home after the League Management Committee turned down an appeal by residents and nearby clubs, stating that under the rules and practice of the league, we have no right to interfere. Green light given, Norris set about pumping money into the project, investing in the region between £80,000 to £120,000 building the new Arsenal Stadium, which was incredibly poor timing, truth be told, as Woolwich Arsenal were relegated in 1913. Despite that, over the course of the next 4 months, a new pitch was laid, a new grandstand was partly built, and terracing and turnstiles were installed. The Arsenal Stadium opened in September 1913, and the club dropped the Woolwich from its name the following year to become Arsenal. So, with the foundations of a new home firmly in place and the financial backing of a successful businessman, you'd assume Arsenal would bounce right back into the top flight of English football with minimum fuss. But you would be wrong. In the 1913-1914 season, Arsenal finished third in the division, missing out on promotion narrowly to Notts County and Bradford Park Avenue. By the end of the 1914-1915 season, Arsenal had finished even worse, dropping down to 5th position below Derby County, Preston North End, Barnsley and Wolverhampton Wanderers. Henry Norris and William Hall were desperate to get the side back into the first division. But they'd both have to be patient, as war had rudely just broken out in Europe, and the Football League shut up shop for the next few years. Flash forward to March 1919, and due to reasons that I covered in this video, an extra slot had opened up in Division 1 for the upcoming 1919-1920 season that the Football League had opened applications for, a slot that Norris and Hall were all too eager to fill. I do go into it in more extensive detail in the aforementioned video, but in short, media pressure, backstage politics and even potentially corruption allowed Arsenal to be elected to the First Division for the upcoming season, at the expense of Tottenham Hotspur, an event that Tottenham fans were quick to let go and don't at all hold against Arsenal to this day. And that's where we'll leave it. Arsenal's journey from South to North London, while seen as controversial, was a necessity for the club to grow post-war to one of the biggest clubs in Europe. Today, Arsenal Football Club is intricately tied with the local community in North London, but it's also important to remember their roots in South London and consider what might have happened had they not made the move. You have to at the very least respect the vision of Norris and Hall all those years ago. Without their grand plans of relocation, there would be no North London is red, North London is lily-white discourse today, because the answer would be obvious. North London is black and amber. Thank you very much for watching once again. This one was the first ever script that I wrote for the channel. It was almost the proof of concept. If it wasn't your thing, then don't worry, there'll be plenty more non-Arsenal related content on the way. But if you did enjoy it, if you did like it, then maybe consider giving this video a like. It would help support the channel even better. Why don't you press the subscribe button? Thank you again for watching.